Content warning. The stories and themes shared throughout this podcast may contain themes that can be distressing for you. If needed, please pause and do what you need to do to take care of yourself. If needed, please reach out to a mental health professional for support.
Welcome back to another episode of Resilient AF with Blair and Alana. But it's just Blair, but that's okay because we have someone really, really special, Moira Khan. She is the owner and founder of GriefSpan. And after the loss of her parents and brother, she became a grief educator, a certified grief educator. She now helps and supports grieving individuals and groups all over the world through the most heartbreaking times of their life. Grief education enables grievers to process the grief in a safe space while learning more about the best practices and tools to help navigate the journey they never asked to be on. Moira has a large community and network on Instagram, and she can be found at griefspan.com. And I am someone who has walked in, hand in hand with grief and complex grief. And so I am so honored that not only are we sharing her story in our book, Resilient AF Stories of Resilience, Volume 2, but that she is here today to talk about her complex grief. Because in the matter of 5 years, she lost both her parents and her brother. And my heart is broken for you, Moira. It's just,
Thank you so much, Blair. And my heart goes out to you and everyone that's lost someone in, our lifetime, which again, like you said, we never asked for.
yeah. And, it's so interesting because, and I want to dive into your story and how your journey to becoming a grief coach came to be. But I think what I really want to just touch on first, because I think you and I have had such complex grief, we don't ask to be grievers. We don't ask for it to happen to us. But what I stepped into not really knowing, but now in hindsight do, is that we are not immune to grief. Grief is part of the human experience. We love hard, we grieve hard. And there are things you can do when you're walking in grief, right? To help move through it. But there's also things that we can do proactively so that when that grief comes, we are more prepared. And that's what I was not. I was not prepared. So I'm so honored that you're here today. So let's talk about your story. Tell us about your journey into the depths of grief.
Oh yes, thank you. It's amazing. I'm so honored to be here too because I have this real affinity with loving and meeting new people, and I have been so honored over the last, I think it's 8 months since I started GriefSpan education and GriefSpan, and it's just been the most phenomenal journey ever. And had you said to me 10 years ago was when I first lost my mum that I would be doing this now, I would have kiboshed it completely and said, no way, absolutely not. How on earth could I ever get to this space that I'm in now with my grief? And 10 years ago was when I lost my mum. And I'm from New Zealand originally, which is, in case anyone doesn't know, I was born and raised in New Zealand. And my parents were actually immigrants from the UK in the 60s and then moved to New Zealand, which is why I was born there. And I had one brother, so there was just the four of us all together. And my mum had sort of not endured the greatest of health throughout her life and was unlucky, but she was a trooper and never really sort of whinged or complained about her illness. And she was, suffered with rheumatoid arthritis. My dad had various things going on, but none of these things you would have ever seen as life-threatening. And also my brother was quite sick as well throughout his life after he sort of reached his 20s. So you could say that the family was not really, blessed with the best of health, but it was nothing like, cancer or terminal or anything that we expected for my mum to go so soon and sudden, and which is what happened in 2014. And I was living in the UK at the time with my husband. We'd been together for 2 or 3 years, and we just found out we were pregnant. And it was only about 6 weeks. And then I ended up flying home to New Zealand because she was in her final days. I just had this gut feeling that it just wasn't going right. And literally, as I was flying to New Zealand, she was declining. And so, my brother and my dad were still there at that point, and it just felt numb. Like I just had no concept of grief at that stage whatsoever. I had lost my grandparents before this, but I hadn't ever known my mum's side of the family, so I didn't actually ever meet my mum's parents. So I didn't have that affinity with my grandparents. And my dad's side, I wasn't really close with either. So I didn't have that sort of very close loss. And so grief was my really first experience when I lost mum, which was devastating. And I didn't deal with it well at all. Like I was pregnant, my first baby, and I just was in denial. I think I just was in denial for the first 9 months. And, up until I had my little girl. And even then I was kind of, obviously when you're being a new mother and everyone says, oh, I put it down to postpartum depression. And the doctor even did, they stuck me on antidepressants and said, off you go. But it wasn't, it was just grief, it really was a lot of grief and lack of sleep, obviously, too. But yeah, and I really just put it off and parked it for a while. And also because my dad wasn't well at that point as well either. So I was worrying about him grieving. I was in another country caring for him from the other side of the world. So it became very complicated. It's that complicated grief. And I also knew that Dad didn't really have a lot longer left either. I think his time was limited by this point as well. And I didn't know, probably max of 2 or 3 years I'd given him as well. So various bits and pieces going on. And then, I sort of made several journeys to New Zealand, one to move my dad back, into a sort of like a retirement home to make sure he had more care. In the meantime, also having a hip replacement and myself. So there's lots of physical stuff going on at the same time for me. And then 2017, I was pregnant with our second one, and it was about 4 weeks after he was born. So it's just coming up, actually, the anniversary. And my 7-year-old now, who just turned 7 yesterday, he was born. And 4 weeks later, I was nursing him at night, and I got this phone call from New Zealand, and it was my step niece. And she said, Alistair's gone. And I was like, what do you mean Alistair's gone? And she said, he's dead. And I'm like, this is my brother. My brother was 47 years old, suffered a cardiac arrest. He hadn't been well. He'd had heart surgery before that, about 16 months prior, but it hadn't worked particularly well. And he was found dead one morning in a hotel room on his own because he was traveling for work. And that was it. And so it was all very sudden, another trauma. And again, I'm postpartum, I'm with our second baby. And again, it's all very complex. I'm not there. I can't go home. I can't be with my dad. I had to call my dad and tell him that his son had died, which is the most, you just don't ever imagine having to do that in your life. It was just so traumatic. And yeah, I don't think I ever dealt with that until a lot later. I moved to Spain after that. So I kind of I piled all these things on, one after the other of coping and just, being a mum. And I think just being a mum on its own with new babies and everything else just kind of parks your grief for a while too. And you just have to get on because who else is going to do what you've got to do? And so that's what happened.
Wow.
And so when we moved to Spain, it was about 4 or 5 months after my brother had passed away. And my dad was ailing still. He wasn't great, but he was still in an apartment in the retirement home. But about a year after I moved to Spain, I had to make the call to whether I should go home again because he was in desperate need of palliative care. And so I took the children home on my own, a 16-month-old and a 3-year-old home to New Zealand on my own on a 27-hour flight, and basically packed him up again, all his belongings, and put him into palliative care, which was in the same, sort of same place that we had him before, but it just was in the palliative care wing. And I had to leave him. And basically that was I think, the hardest part was leaving him again, knowing that was probably the last time I was going to see him alive. And yeah, and then that Christmas, literally about 6 months later, I got a call on the Christmas Eve that he'd gone. So he slipped away, and I wasn't able to get home for that time because I had just had major foot surgery. So you can see there's a sort of recurring pattern here. Um, and I just couldn't get on a plane, and I wasn't meant to be able to fly for at least 2 or 3 months. So I was kind of planning after he'd gone that I would go home, do a memorial service, and all the rest to say goodbye. And guess what happened? COVID hit, and I couldn't get home. So it was all very, strung out again. I had this delayed grief because I couldn't say goodbye. I had no closure. I couldn't even do his estate and everything because everything was in lockdown. I couldn't do anything like even get papers sent or any of that stuff. So I had to even delay all of that. So I had no closure for at least a year, 14 months until I could get back again to do all of that. So yeah, I like to say, it's made me stronger, but who in the heck would have expected all of this? I'm 46 now, and that was all in the space of 5 years. And I knew that I had a purpose, but I didn't know what up until 2 years ago, which has kind of brought me to where I am now.
Yeah. Wow. First of all, thank you so much for sharing all of that. My heart is broken for you. That is a lot of layers to navigate.
Thank you.
Um, yeah, and like it's just not even being in the same part of the world and having to go back and forth and with, your with health, like, birthing humans and getting body parts fixed.
Yeah.
It just adds this whole other layer and, just your story is so harrowing and what is so impressive when I talk to people like you who've been through such complex grief and so many different layers and delayed grief and you know when you turn that grief into a tool to help others. And you just said you didn't know till a couple years ago that this is the path you're walking on. Like what were you doing before that and how did you know that you wanted to work in the grief space?
I don't know if there was ever a real defining moment, but I knew I wanted to help in some way or at least impart my story
Hmm.
in a way that would inspire others or at least help others and know that they weren't alone. I think that was my biggest kind of back thought until I really sort of felt I started looking for like coaching programs and all sorts of things over a period of 2 years just to see, wait and just kind of waiting until I found the right thing. My old job was a project manager, and which I still do a little, I dabble a little bit now still, but that was my old corporate life. I worked in law firms. I was a technical project manager. That was my thing for years until I happened to have the kids. But I knew I didn't want to go back to that or at least full time. And so when I did eventually find what I wanted to do and came across David Kessler's course, which was the certified grief educator and coaching course, it just resonated with me, and I felt like it was the right one. It spoke to me. So I did that almost 2 years ago now. And yeah, and then it was just basically a journey of sort of coming up with what I've got now, which is grief span education. And grief span is literally a sort of a tribute to my dad because of his wee company that he used to have in New Zealand, which was called Time Span. And my dad was a great writer as well, and he just loved to tell stories. He's got journals that I just haven't never had time to go through, and I've got all in storage. And he was a prolific writer and storyteller. And so Grief Span just spoke to me, and it just seemed and felt like the right thing, and kind of a tribute, not just to dad, but to my parents and my brother. And so now, I'm able to offer an actual space where I'm educated, and I'm always researching, grief as a space and a topic because it really resonates with me now as to how much, I've healed over the last however many years. and how I've got to this point and how I really want to help people get to this point as well. And I recognize it so much when people say they're stuck, I can feel it. I just have this thing that I can feel people, you can just tell, but the instance I get on some calls with clients, you can tell that they're just so distraught or so in need of some kind of positivity, that there is another light at the end of the tunnel somewhere, that we will never get over this, what we've been through, but there is some purpose behind what we've been through. And, that we only have one life and what to do that, and
Yeah. Yeah. And I love it. And it's interesting because I'm a grief and resilience coach. And so with us, there's some overlap. And what I think is really cool is that I'm sure you've discovered this. There's so many phenomenal books and resources in the grief space. Like I just bought David Kessler's Finding Meaning workbook, and I'm studying
yeah,
under Dr. Claire Bidwell Smith right now, and she's amazing. And it's like every time I meet someone, and they tell me about a resource or a podcast, it's like we have these tools, but I think what the missing piece is those grief coaches, because we are not therapists and counselors. And
exactly.
by the time clients I know come to me, like they've kind of hit a wall with their therapist or their counselor, or they want to try something new. So, what if working with you or, a professional like you or me or anyone in our realm wasn't a last ditch effort? What if it was something that people choose to do from the beginning, eh, you know, along with other mental health professionals? And
Yeah.
I think educating on that space and how you support people moving forward is so important. And it's not just that you're trained, but you have lived experience, real lived experience in navigating complex grief. So I
Yeah,
think
and
it's,
that's
yeah.
the difference, isn't it? That's, I think, and I've said this quite a few times now, and I think that's the difference, is that people, because they relate, and I think given that yours and I's, expertise are relatively new, in a sense that they're not as well known as going to your typical therapist, or,
Mhm.
what we class as a therapist, which is in no disrespect to what they do, or, because I know it takes years of training. But when you've experienced grief and you've been through it, and then you're looking for someone to relate to, grief education and grief coaching is quite amazing, in the sense that, you don't necessarily want to dive into childhood past or trauma. This is about the situation that you find yourself in that you didn't choose to be in.
Mhm.
Grief education and grief coaching is all about navigating a new space that we never even imagined that we'd be in, even though it's inevitable. We're all going to face grief at some point. But if
Yeah.
you come into it like us, unexpectedly, earlier than normal, how on earth are you? I mean, I was one of the first friends out of my group to lose my parents. And I've been navigating that space for about 10 years up until now, and
Yeah.
none of my friends had lost their parents up until probably quite recently. So, and who do I turn to? Who do I, share these things with, or who understands how I'm feeling? My husband doesn't even understand it because he hasn't lost his either. So it's a very individual space for a while if you don't have anyone around you that can relate to you.
Yeah, I think that's a really important thing. And also, when you're going through grief, the people you want to rely on or depend on or lean on are your families, your friends, but often they're also impacted by this grief. And so,
Mm.
when you work with an expert, I like to say, I'm your griefy BFF. I'm that person who's
Yeah.
going to hold your hand forward. And
Yeah.
it's not about looking back or diagnosing, it's about building that path forward. And I love it. I'm so excited that we are in each other's worlds, because this is such important work and you are really carving out your own path, a notable path in the grief education and coaching space. And so it's such an honor to have you here with us and have your story be told in our book. And I think it's the beginning of something really beautiful, because grief coaching isn't going anywhere, just like doulas, right? Like birth doulas. That used to
Yeah.
not be a thing, and now like some governments cover it. And
Yeah.
I know that I became the expert I wish I had because I am also the first. And the world is full of grief. There's so many different types of grief, and we don't have to sit in our pain. There is a way forward, and you can throw shit at the wall hoping something sticks, or you can work with an expert to help you through it so you're not sitting in that life altering pain for as long as you would be, right? And so
Yeah.
thank you for the work that you do. It's really important work. So,
Thank you. You're welcome. Thank you so much. It's
yeah.
awesome.
And so, you know, as we wrap up, I highly suggest that everyone that's listening to this goes to the show notes and clicks on the gift. It's a 28-day grief tip calendar. It's a free calendar with a tip a day for 28 days. I downloaded it. I think it's absolutely amazing. And if someone you know is stuck in their grief, send this to them. Send this to them, because I know that I could probably speak on behalf of Moira, but when I was in deep grief, anytime someone gave me a resource, if I had the capacity, I would review it, devour it, listen to it, read it. I just wanted to feel better. So this is definitely something that will help move the needle. Her social media links are also in the show notes. So I invite you to enter the world of Moira Khan and Grief Span, and dive into the change she is making in the world of grief work. Before we wrap up, let's hear a piece of advice for someone who's navigating such significant loss in such a short period of time like you did.
I think if I was to go back and if someone had said to me, this is what you're about to face, oh, it's all very well for us to say, oh, have a magic 8 ball and all the rest of it. But I think the biggest piece I would say now for me would be to
Mhm.
lean into everything that's around you that can hold you up and support you through this tough time, because we can be as tough on the outside as we think we're going to be and all the rest of it, but we are going to have moments where we just cannot function. And, if you have a support network, lean on it and take it. Take the help that people are offering. I know there will be people in this life that say to you, I'll be here when you need me, and quite often aren't. But there are the ones that are, and there are people that may just disappear in this space because they don't know how to be comfortable around you or they don't know how to react. But there will be the shining ones that will. And all I can say is to lean in and just accept help. Say to someone, just come round. Or if someone says, I want to come round and just make you coffee, then just let them help you, let them, because if the more you share your story and the more you share about your grief, even if you don't say anything, it's okay too. But the more you talk about it, the amount that I have healed in the last 6 months alone by doing what I'm doing is phenomenal. Like I never would I thought I would have healed even more. So just lean in and accept help, and also just create your own little space if you can as well. Like create your space, even if you just create your own private Instagram page and sharing your stories. You don't have to make it public even, but
Mhm.
share your story because it will help.
Beautiful advice. Well, we know I love and advocate for the sharing of the story piece, whether it's to yourself or publicly. But
Absolutely.
yeah, so thank you so much for taking the time to be with us
No,
on Resilient AF. I appreciate.
thank you. I'm really honoured too. Thank you so much for making this space available to us too, Blair.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And to you, our listeners, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Resilient AF. We're here to empower you to bounce forward, to strengthen your resilience muscle, to be that lighthouse in the storm. Just remember, it is okay to not be okay. You will get through it because you are Resilient AF. That's a wrap for another episode of Resilient AF with Blair and Alana. And thank you for listening. Are you feeling inspired to bounce forward?
Let's connect at theglobalresilienceproject.com, where you can read many stories of resilience, buy our books, shop our clothing line, learn more about how to strengthen your resilience muscle, be empowered, and more.
Remember, friends, you are Resilient AF.